Gettysburg Museum of History Studios.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Good afternoon. It's nice to see so many of you still hanging on, especially for what will be not ending on a high note, but I fear ending on a low note. That is to say, the kind of unpleasant parts of the Civil War. So this is a panel on atrocity, and we are going to talk for, 45 minutes or so. I think we actually have an hour and a quarter, which may be longer than we need, because you may just simply get despair, for the human soul and decide we should go eat. But we will talk for maybe 45 minutes as a group, and then have time for questions from you all from the floor. So I'm going to very quickly introduce people, mostly because if you've been around the last day or two, you will have already heard their introductions, and then we'll start framing a conversation. So my name is Aaron Sheehan-Dean. I'm a professor of history at Louisiana State University, and excited to be back at CWI again. So I'm going to start with Jaime Martinez, who teaches at UNC Pembroke, and she deserves your special sympathy because she's department chair as well as a faculty member at the moment, and we appreciate your service. Jaime is the author of Confederate Slave Impressment, which is an excellent book, still I think a copy or two over there on the table, as well as someone who's done a lot of public history in North Carolina, and is working right now on the experience of Southeast indigenous people in the Civil War era. Next to Jaime is Cecily Zander, who is an assistant professor at Texas Women's University outside Dallas. She has a brand new book called Army Under Fire, Anti-Militarism in the Civil War Era, published by LSU Press. No connection. I don't have any connection to the press, but was excited to see that. It's sort of across the quad, but we don't interact a lot. And Cecily also, as you heard earlier in her talk on John Pope, is starting to work on a project on Lincoln and the West. Next to Cecily is Ethan Rafuse, who is at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. He's written a slew of books, many of which I suspect you're familiar with, including the work on McClellan that Pete mentioned, as well as Robert E. Lee and the Fall of the Confederacy. He spoke a few minutes ago on Missouri and sort of previewed some of the atrocities to come in talking about the guerrillas of that space. And then at the end of the table is Angela Riotto, who is at the Defense Security Cooperative University's, now I can't remember right, Research Analysis and Lessons Learned Institute. I wasn't sure if they used DISCU Raleigh as their acronym.
Yes, DSCU Raleigh.
DSCU Raleigh. I wasn't far. Okay. So, lessons learned is actually one of the things that I hope that we can talk about here, in the sense that I had this quote in the book that I talked about the other day, though I didn't say it in the lesson, that Kurt Vonnegut in the beginning of Slaughterhouse-Five says, "There's nothing intelligent to be said about a massacre." And I hope that he's wrong. I hope that we can prove him wrong, that in fact talking about things like massacres and atrocities is valuable and important, even if unpleasant. So let me finish with introducing Angela, who studies prisoner of war camps. She's working on a book now called Beyond the Prison Pen. Some of you might have heard her talking about the Fort Pillow massacre. So we have the right set of panelists up here to engage on this topic. And like I said, I hope that we're able to make sense of events in the war that are sometimes sidelined. I think Pete was making this argument and talking about the Hicksford raid, and one of the issues that we'll talk about a little bit towards the end, I think, is the role of archives and evidence, and also the role of silence in enabling or later concealing atrocities. So I thought it might be useful to start by having the panelists reflect on definitions. That is, how do we understand what an atrocity is? And I'm going to say this in the Civil War. Like guerrilla, the term atrocity changes over time. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, it continues to be relevant, but I think it does attain a different valence. And so I might ask people to sort of reflect on the subjects they've studied, the atrocities that they know or want to talk about, in particular thinking about who is involved as perpetrators in these, who are the victims, the ways in which causes play out over time. I think part of what Pete was discussing and thinking about the Ixford raid is the role of momentum and kind of inertia in events. And some atrocities in the Civil War respond to that, and others are sort of premeditated and deliberate in a different way. And so let's start there, if that's enough of. I was going to try to do we didn't really organize, so a kind of long-winded prelude to give you time to think about definitions. But if somebody wants to start us off by thinking about how we can frame this. Angela, you want to start?
We have to turn this off. All right. Awesome. No, I'll kick off if you guys don't mind. That's a great place to start, I think, Aaron. And I think you really kicked us off yesterday talking about combatants versus non-combatants. And that kind of leads us into, especially for prisoners of war, those who were at Andersonville or other various prisons felt that they were victims of atrocities, of abuse, especially because they can no longer fight back, right? They were not in a place to defend themselves. They're not on the field of battle anymore. They're not a frontline troop against a frontline troop. Now they feel like they're victims of home guards, people who weren't fighting, and they couldn't defend themselves against that. So anything that they, like being shot at the deadline or being abused out getting firewood or being starved, they felt like there was no way for them to defend themselves any longer, so they became victims rather than fighters.
Can I gloss that briefly to say, it sounds like what you're saying is that atrocities are not simply committed by irregular actors, but in fact states can commit atrocities. And I think we tend to identify atrocities as sort of happening in the margins, usually by guerrillas or bushwhackers or others, but in fact atrocities can be deliberate and sort of slow motion, right? Andersonville happened over months of starvation and disease to produce that.
Yeah, it can be systematic.
Yeah.
Yeah, the combatant non-combatant distinction, of course, is the big one here. I mean, you talk about what happens to 1st Texas in the cornfield at Antietam and the slaughter that takes place of them. I've never heard anybody call that an atrocity. The people who are killed at Lawrence it's considered an atrocity, and so that combatant non-combatant distinction is critical.
Can you explain Lawrence? Just give us a kind of thumbnail, because I don't know that everybody necessarily has that.
Yeah, I guess I did rush through it a bit. What happened was William Quantrill's Raiders operated in western Missouri during the Civil War. They did not like Lawrence, Kansas, because Lawrence, Kansas had bad memories from the Bleeding Kansas days. It was named for Amos Lawrence, who was the financier for the New England Immigrant Aid Society, which helped New Englanders, people who opposed slavery, move to Kansas in order to win the popular sovereignty contest out there. And also, if they needed weapons were provided. And so in 1856, there was a sack of Lawrence by a posse that was organized by the territorial government, which was a legitimate, it was a legal government, because it was authorized by the Buchanan administration. It wasn't a legitimate government because, perhaps up at that point, it would not be a legitimate government. A legal government is one that's got legal authority. A legitimate government is one that's got the consent of the governed. When we talk about the American Revolution, we make distinction between the legal and the legitimate. The revolution took place because Americans decided the legal authorities of Great Britain were no longer legitimate authorities, and they'd organize their legitimate authorities. Something like that plays out in Bleeding Kansas, in which you had these legal authorities, you had the border ruffians coming in, and these are legal territorial governments because they're authorized under the law, but they're not legitimate because they do not represent the will of the people. And before the will of the people gets so anti-slavery that there's no chance of slavery being established in Kansas, Lawrence becomes a particular point of ire, and they order the arrest of the Free State people in Lawrence because they're lawbreakers, maybe legitimate, but they're not legal. And so they attack Lawrence, and as is often the case, they get out of hand, and that's the first sack of Lawrence in 1856. Needless to say, the people of Lawrence and Kansas, once Kansas becomes a state and things start going off in Missouri in 1861, see an opportunity for revenge, and they conduct raids into western Missouri. And one particular incident, the sack of Osceola, it provides a spur to many western Missourians to join up with these guerrilla forces, particularly around the leadership of William Clark Quantrell. And Quantrell, in August of 1863, orders a raid on Lawrence, in which he pretty much sacks the town and kills about 150 to 200 non-combatants. To one extent, it's a legitimate act. They're trying to go to Lawrence to try to find James Lane, who is a very important political figure and thus would make him a legitimate political target. They don't get him, and so they attack the town and they kill a lot of non-combatants. And the response of this to the federal government is sometimes viewed as the counter-atrocity in Confederate propaganda, which is Order Number 11, which is issued by Thomas Ewing, brother-in-law of William Tecumseh Sherman, so sure to be loved by future generations of Southerners. And basically it orders the counties along the border with Kansas, the people to get off their land and go assemble in communities where the federal government has military and they can protect them. And the idea is the classic way you defeat counterinsurgents is to deny them support of the water in which they swim, to borrow Mao's concept. And this becomes a big issue for post-war Missourians of Confederate sympathies, the horrible atrocity of Order Number 11. And one of the people who was talking to Thomas Ewing before he issued it was George Caleb Bingham, who was a very famous artist. And Bingham said, if you do this, I will make you infamous through art. And there's a very famous painting called Order Number 11 that shows a civilian dead and Ewing sitting, riding his horse, looking on impassively. To go back to our theme and that long-winded spiel, the concept that this was Lawrence may have been bad, but this was also atrocity as well.
So can I follow up, and this is maybe something Cecily and maybe Jamie can add on too, is do you think that when the atrocity is committed by someone who is military or paramilitary against a non-combatant, is that what makes it more of an atrocity versus if it's combatants versus combatants, or vice versa?
I can sort of give it a shot, and I think sort of one thing that I think about is not necessarily combatants or non-combatants, but who you recognize as fighting in a legitimate way. So we could talk about regular and irregular warfare in this way. And oftentimes what the federal government will do is to justify, especially atrocities committed against Native peoples, is say we don't recognize them as legitimate combatants because they don't fight in a way that is legitimate to us. And so Ethan mentioned, right, that some of these great slaughters during the Civil War are not recognized as atrocities, especially when they take place on battlefields such as Gettysburg or Antietam, or think of the main unit at Petersburg, which loses something like 80% of its men in a single attack, because those are legitimate forces fighting legitimate forces in a regular fashion that both sides recognize. And so when Lieber develops his code, one thing he's thinking about is regular warfare, and we can often code that as European-style warfare. So these two armies recognize one another, they recognize the way they are fighting, and within the boundaries of that space, they are perfectly well within their rights to do what they're doing. But when you get outside of that space and you don't recognize your opponent as a legitimate combatant, as I said, and this is most often the case in terms of Native American warfare, then you're not going to act in the same way. And you end up with incidents and events like Sand Creek. But we also have to remember at Sand Creek, there was one regiment that held back because the commander of that regiment recognized that what was occurring on the ground, what had been planned by John Shivington, was an atrocity. And he didn't want to be involved in it because he did recognize there was illegitimacy involved in the attack on a camp of Native American sort of men, women, and children. And so that's another kind of twist I would put on that. I don't know if it answers Angela's question directly, but it's that kind of question of regular and irregular. Do you see your opponent as legitimate, and therefore do you accord him the respect that the laws of war or the rules of war of your society or your culture dictate?
Well, and I think sort of expand beyond questions of combatants and non-combatants, there's also the question of citizens and prospective citizens. And I thought of this a lot during Professor Holzer's presentation Friday night, and also Aaron, when you were speaking, is this that people who were not seen as potential citizens didn't deserve the same level of respect from the government, and didn't deserve proportional responses. And so I think we can add, forced relocation of the Navajo during the war, forced relocation of a number of Native nations immediately after the war, in part because of the choices they made during the war, to our list of state-sponsored atrocities that are part of the story of the Civil War, and weren't necessarily involving combat, but clearly those things involved a lot of violence as well.
Part of this, too, hinges also, I think, on 19th century understandings of the body and pain. Right, so there's a kind of widespread expectation or assumption among 19th century white Americans that black Americans don't experience pain in the same way. I mean, this persists it's still a remaining problem in the medical community today. I mean, studies continue to come out about the ways in which doctors don't prescribe pain relievers to black patients the way they do to white patients presenting with the same problems. But what this meant, I think, in the 19th century was an even more callous attitude, particularly in the contraband camps, and we started this conversation in a couple of panels, to the suffering of people. The death rates in contraband camps were nearly as high for many people as they were in battle. And these were ostensibly non-combatants doing support work for the armies. And the military is keeping track. They know what the rates of death from disease are, and they're extraordinarily high. But I think part of what's governing that is an assumption, this would apply as well to indigenous people, is that their physical bodies are calibrated to are sensitized to pain in a way differently than white bodies. I mean, we don't believe that anymore, notwithstanding the continuing problems. But I think, so there are sort of cultural elements here that factor in as well as the kind of ideological hinges that we've been talking about. Let me ask you all to reflect a little bit, if I can, on sort of the purpose, if we can even claim that there is purpose in some of the atrocities that happen. But it does seem to me that sometimes there are atrocities that are intended as punishment. I mean, for instance, in the Dakota War, Pope's, the quote, Cecily, that you had, was clearly a kind of revenge-driven option. Whereas in other contexts, there are commanders who see what we would regard as an atrocity as something more like compliance. They are trying to pull a population or merely trying to terrify. I'm thinking about John McNeil or not John McNeil, but the General McNeil in Missouri. Ethan, you probably know this, when McNeil, who had already killed 10 citizens in Missouri, this is in 1862, he made a comment about how as his troops advanced, it was raining most days, and their flags were covered by black flag covers. And he said that the perception among civilians was that we were flying the black flag, and that was fine. That kind of a rumor of rape and atrocity was moving ahead of McNeil's army because of this visual sign, and he didn't try to correct that. He was intentionally, in other words, using fear and terror in the population for a political objective separate from punishment. There's no he wasn't proactively punishing. So I don't know if...
But you're saying a utilitarian value to atrocity.
Yeah.
That there is a practice. Yeah, I mean, this is articulated in, again, this comes out a lot in counterinsurgency of the 1950s among French officers who are discussing the problem in Algeria, which is, if you take someone who's not following the laws of war and you respect him according to the laws of war, you've taken away the incentive for people to obey the laws of war. So in torturing a terrorist, a non-combatant, because that non-combatant was breaking the rules, you're actually serving the higher purpose of keeping war within its bounds. Because there's no penalty for exceeding the bounds of war, nobody's going to follow the bounds of war. So I'm breaking the laws of, I'm not breaking the laws of war because as I said in my talk, there's the combatant, non-combatant assumption. You can shoot, you can't shoot. You can be shot at, you can't be shot at. And if you don't follow that rule, that fundamental rule of war, again, the utilitarian value of atrocity. This is the way we keep the war in a civilized direction to keep it from becoming an uncivilized effort. So there is that utilitarian, and also the terror value. I mean, purpose of war is to use violence to have a political effect, and well, a little bit of violence isn't getting your political effect. You can either give up your political goal or escalate your violence, and that's off. You know, the objection of French officers when they were court-martialed and getting letters of a reprimand for what they were doing in Algeria was, you gave us this higher goal of suppressing the rebellion. We did it, and then now you're going to prosecute us for achieving the goals that you sent us to do. Mm-hmm. And again, this kind of effort, there's the political objectives established, the military objectives, and you try to keep these two separated, which is often a problematic part of the discourse of warfare.
Angela, do you think that at Fort Pillow there is a kind of objective there, or is that something that happens sort of spontaneously? And I would use that word. I probably shouldn't even use that word. I mean, they know they're going to be facing black soldiers, so it's not a surprise. Yeah,
but this is, we kind of talked about in the panel yesterday, is that this is not the first time that they have come across black soldiers, and we don't have this type of massacre. So what kind of led to it? So I actually have two things, one for Fort Pillow, and then I wanted to talk maybe at more the tactical level at Andersonville, because I think Ethan's talking more strategic, political level, but I think you can have utilitarian atrocity at a much smaller tactical level as well. Fort Pillow, Forrest has a few statements kind of urging his men on and creating this kind of context of violence where he's saying that they are fighting against their masters. They're, possibly inciting this insurrection. So I think maybe he's thinking if we perpetuate this violence against black soldiers and also unionists, perhaps we are going to keep them in their place. We will keep other blacks from enlisting. We keep unionists from West Tennessee from kind of betraying their home state, kind of sending a message to those who might want to enlist or fight in the future. And then that was for Fort Pillow. And I was thinking when Ethan was talking, again, much smaller level, and this is maybe more individual camp unit based, is you mentioned yesterday, Aaron, the deadline at Andersonville. And this is at other camps, but Andersonville is the most infamous, I think, where there is this perimeter within the stockade that if you cross it, you're liable to be shot, right? And there's stories that, the guards would just pick off people for fun, or they think that they were going to get a furlough or what for it. But really the purpose of it is control, right? To keep people within such a small space, because Andersonville starts at only, I believe, 13 and a half acres. It's very small, 10,000 people. It's going to be increased to 26 and a half acres, but with 33,000 people, it's a lot of people, very small space. How do you control them? You use it with fear, right? So again, it's not this huge strategic political purpose, but the Confederates would say, oh, it's for a purpose, right? We're just trying to control people. The Union prisoners, though, consider that an atrocity.
Well, I think we could think about threats of violence, at least against civilians, against the home front. Thinking about, Davis saying they're going to fire on the women during the bread riots. There's when I was doing my research on slave impressment, I found multiple instances where the North Carolina militia is ordered out to go and collect the slaves, and they're told people are going to resist. Enslaved people are going to resist. Slaveholders are going to resist. If you're collecting free people of color, they're going to resist. And, if somebody dies because you had to kill them to enforce it, that's unfortunate, but it's not illegal, right? And so there is this sense where, controlling the civilian population might also include some things that we would certainly think of as atrocities, but they were, again, state-sanctioned acts of violence, or at least threats of violence.
Yeah, and I think there's a sort of really important conversation about both intention and objective that we need to think about, because as I mentioned sort of earlier in my talk, what John Pope proposes to do against the Dakota in 1862 is really a preview of the orders you see to sort of decimate the Shenandoah Valley and that presaged Sherman's march through Georgia and the Carolinas. but because Sherman and Sheridan's intention and objective in those campaigns falls within the sort of legitimate plan of the Union war effort, which is you need to undermine the Confederacy because what's keeping them going is the supply line they have, these places like Georgia and the Valley, which are growing the food that's fueling the armies and where slavery is continuing to exist. By taking that away, by destroying that, those fall outside of the category of atrocity, unless you're looking at the civilians in the paths of that violence who do recall those events, right, as sort of atrocities. But there's also the fact that in the memory of the war, the destruction of the Valley and the March to the Sea are viewed as sort of two of the integral events that get Lincoln reelected, that really helped the Union win the war. And so we don't think of them that way, even though there is a group or a population that might continue to remember them that way. So we have to think about memory as well. But if we look at something like Sand Creek, the intention and the objective might have been clearly stated by John Shivington. Claims were made later that this group had threatened to march on the Front Range, right? They were threatening Denver and the mining settlements. But we know that this isn't true. So the objective there is to essentially commit a slaughter. And Shivington knows this, and the 3 federal investigations that take place essentially reveal this by the end, right? The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, the internal Army investigation, and the subsequent congressional investigation all say that even though these were technically state actors, this falls way beyond the bounds. The intention and the objective were both wrong here, and therefore it is essentially put down as an atrocity. So there's that really interesting kind of conversation to have too. What's your intention? What's your objective? Within the bounds of a war, are they legitimate? And when we think of Sand Creek as a Civil War event, it becomes even more interesting because it's happening simultaneously with these kind of really escalations of hard war or even total war against Confederates. But what really appears to us as the aberration, quite ironically, for most of American history, incidences of violence against Native Americans are not viewed as atrocities. Sand Creek in 1864 stands out as a much greater atrocity than does the March to the Sea or the burning of the Valley.
I love that you brought up memory and narrative and how it's remembered, or at least how it's talked about, which my work focuses on. But I just wanted to you mentioned the Shenandoah Valley. And I don't know if you guys ever saw the old John Wayne movie, Rio Grande. John Wayne, right? Maureen O'Hara. And Maureen O'Hara is supposed to be a Virginian with her Irish accent. And they fought for Sheridan in the Valley, so she keeps saying arsonist, murderer, kind of giving them a hard time. But for them, it's legitimate, right? But that's a famous movie that people have watched, and that's creating a specific narrative that people know then. So it depends on which side you're on. Is it legitimate? Was it type of that hard war strategy? Or is it that you are actually committing crimes like arson and murder? So it's very fascinating. But I was just thinking especially for POWs, again, what that narrative is and who writes that story, because it could very much be that they didn't always want to say victims, but right after the war, they often portrayed themselves as victims of these atrocious acts, especially when they're trying to get pensions. That's going to play a huge role. It's going to change as they get older and they become more kind of reconciliationists, where the hatred and the talk of atrocity actually decrease in their memoirs as they're getting older and more of them are dying. You see that vitriol hatred, and it's more like, oh, it was only certain guards that were bad. They weren't all bad. So it's interesting also memory and narrative, how that changes.
Yeah, so let's pick up on that and maybe talk a little bit more. I mean, I'm intrigued, Cecily, by your comment about, you said something like, well, now we know, right? And so, I mean, a big part of this, and this connects to some of the comments that Pete was making in his Hicksford raid talk, thinking about the silences in the archive, the records that weren't kept, and the things that we don't know. And so the ways in which atrocity and the role of rumor, which is really essential in this. I mean, the example I just gave of McNeil in Missouri, he's hastening rumor, right, which is going to then kind of snarl the post-war memory. Maybe his army did ride under the black flag. So I wonder if you all can talk about the ways in which, for some of these episodes, evidence comes into view, or maybe more evidence comes into view. I mean, we know, for instance, at Fort Pillow that there's a congressional investigation, but most of the histories of Fort Pillow that have been written today, the convincing ones are the ones that feature Achilles Clark and some of the Confederates writing privately, and of course the congressional investigators did not have access to that material. I mean, it confirms it, the arguments, but so if people might want to reflect on that, sort of how we know that these are atrocities, and how people might have known at the time or not known.
Well, I think something we talked about yesterday, and again, I would love to hear from you guys, is that the thing that makes Fort Pillow so unique is that there are so many survivors. There are so many witnesses, and there's so many Confederates who are also willing to tell the story, right? I mentioned yesterday, one of the participants from the Confederate side actually published a book, and it becomes a great seller, and Forrest himself buys it. Like, he's not ashamed to tell this story, and that's what makes Fort Pillow unique. But how many other episodes of violence are there that we don't know about because there were no survivors left, right? I used to do this while I was teaching. I always reference movies, but in the Pirates of the Caribbean, there's this story. It was like, well, they leave no survivors, and they're like, well, where do the stories come from then, right? Fort Pillow we know exists because there's so many survivors and there's so many witnesses. What about so many that we don't have because everyone was killed and maybe the participants didn't tell their stories?
Yeah, I was going to say that the sort of Fort Pillow, we continue to reassess it, and there's also the kind of ways in which our sort of current scholarly fascination reflects this. And if you all haven't read Clayton Butler's book on white Unionists who fought, Southern Unionists who fought for the United States Army, he has a really interesting argument about Fort Pillow in which he argues that the white soldiers who were also killed in large numbers, not as significant as the Confederates, were viewed as not just traitors, but race traitors. And so there's a question there too. And I think in the moment, we can't say that every Confederate was thinking about this, but when they look back on it and they're trying to reason through it, like that's certainly something that's going on. And he finds that language where they literally say these white troops, these white Tennesseans who were at the fort with the United States colored troops were traitors not only to the South, but traitors to the white race. And so you have that factor too in these different kind of valences and the way that people are thinking about things after the fact. And then in terms of sort of indigenous warfare, again, Aaron, you sort of mentioned silences or places where we don't have the record. If you all haven't read Ari Kelman's book on the Sand Creek Massacre, it's a phenomenal look at exactly kind of how this conversation takes place and which groups are willing to speak about events and which groups are less willing to do so. And when the Sand Creek Massacre site was developed in eastern Colorado, in the sort of early part of the 20th century, a concerted effort was made to include Native peoples, Native descendants of the Sand Creek incident in the planning and the process. But there were contentious arguments about whose story should be centered at the site, how much of that history that Native people felt they wanted to share with a sort of broader kind of public audience and whose story had the right to be told. And so you also have this continual negotiation over memory in this conversation. And you have to include kind of all sides, if at all possible. And the story of the Sand Creek site development is really, really interesting in that regard. But we also have the fact for some of these sort of events, and I mentioned the sort of Bear River Massacre in my talk, the Marias Massacre, it can sometimes take decades or even a century or more for the stories to come out. And so sometimes it's just a matter of patience. So the Marias Massacre, which involves Piegan and Blackfeet people in Montana in about 1870, the story from the Native perspective really wasn't told until a man named James Welch wrote a novel called Fool's Crow well into the 20th century, I think in the 1960s. And he used oral history and oral tradition, which of course historians didn't have access to because they weren't part of the communities producing that sort of tradition. They weren't part of the communities from which that evidence was coming. And so only since then have books been written about the massacre that include the Native perspective. So sometimes it's about patience and digging and waiting for those sources, but also for the communities that are involved to take the time to be willing and ready to share their stories and to develop the trust that it is required between the historians who want to write about it and the communities that are represented to really fairly tell those stories. So I think that's an important archival part of the story.
Have we established what makes an incident an atrocity? I mean, Fort Pillow, obviously. Okay, the massacre in the crater, obviously. Lawrence, obviously. Okay, 2 people? 3 people? Because if you're a Missouri family, both my brothers got killed by bushwhackers. That was an atrocity. I had two brothers killed. It's not Fort Pillow, or it's not Sand Creek, right? I mean, have we established when it becomes an atrocity and when it just becomes one of the unfortunate incidents of war?
I think that, atrocity is a term of art, right?
Again, unfortunate incidents of war. Okay, that covers so much.
Much of the, I would say, the historiographical kind of conversation about this, and I'm thinking about this partly in relation to what you were just saying, Cecily, about kind of public changes in public awareness, right? If we think about how guerrillas were represented, and I was going to ask you about this, Ethan, in relationship to Missouri. I'm a huge Bruce Springsteen fan. I love the Seeger Session albums. He recycled the Seeger song, basically celebrating Jesse James. Right? That's like the one thing that I hate that the boss did, in which, that is, we sort of tell a mythology about Frank and Jesse James that turns them from pro-slavery psychopaths into modern Robin Hood. And if you kind of track the historiography of the guerrillas in Missouri, we have moved from a kind of, gray ghosty kind of lionization in the 30s and 40s, as I read it, in 50s and 60s and 70s, into something much more critical today.
Again, 5. Is it an atrocity now?
Do we just?
Is it 7? Is it an atrocity now?
Does
Is it
there
8?
have to have a number? I think it's more of the violation of something. So the idea that you're violating the laws and customs of war, you're violating someone's right to live. Like, I think could be a lowercase atrocity.
Which again, a lot of those can be called the unfortunate byproducts of war.
Okay. The purposeful targeting. Even if it's only 2 people, it could still be an atrocity. Because you're violating expectations of what is a combatant and who deserves to be protected under the laws and customs of war. Even if it's only 2 people, it's still an atrocity. I don't think you need 200 people to make an atrocity. It might be a capital A atrocity, but I don't think it makes it any less. What do you guys think? Did you just push it away?
No, Jamie really wanted to talk.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely reluctant to put numbers on it, and I think if we think about it might be a matter of collective impact as well, of individual actions over time that sort of add up to a bigger whole as well. And particularly if we carry the story into the Reconstruction era and think about, we definitely think about the incidents where hundreds of people die in Reconstruction, but also we can just think of sort of the daily collective hum of violence over 12 years and the impact of that. And so I think I'm also reluctant to put numbers on things.
Again, atrocity is the starburst, right? It's an incident, right? It shows you, as opposed to the day-to-day process, as opposed to war as event and these series of events that link to each other, as opposed to a daily process grind.
But Ethan, I think you're onto something with your term
No, I'm not.
No, I think you are.
I'm on something.
This is why we wanted to sit next to each other. Is about who's telling the story, who is defining it. I think if the victim, or maybe the victim's family or loved ones, what have you, or a member of that community, to them it's an atrocity regardless of the number. But maybe the perpetrators or people within that system of the perpetrators might only consider it an unfortunate event of war. Like, that was terrible, but it's war. The person who actually was the victim or what have you, that was the atrocity.
Right. This is the nature of military spin, right? When you were talking, Jamie, I was thinking of William Mumford, who's a civilian living in New Orleans when Farragut's ships arrive. Farragut's men raise a flag and say, "Don't pull the flag down because it tells our men that we're not in a state of hostilities." And Mumford runs to the top of the Mint, today the Jazz Museum of New Orleans, and hauls the flag down. And Butler has that man executed. And it becomes one of the first major contretemps and kind of controversies around the laws of war between the Union and the Confederacy, all the way up to Lee and McClellan writing to each other. I don't know that the Confederates used the language of atrocity, though they classify Butler as a war criminal. So sort of effectively they do. And that's a single case. Right? Because it's an abnormal and, in their view, unjust murder of a civilian by military forces. So I think that what it reveals is the kind of political nature of using a term like atrocity.
But again, didn't Butler go through a legal process with Munford in which he was given the process. We went through the legal process, this higher constitutional process that we were fighting for the war to preserve. This guy is engaged in acts that undermines that process. We went through the process with him. He got a trial. He got defense.
Again, it's who's telling the story.
And it wasn't an atrocity. The atrocity would have been not punishing him, because then you would encourage everybody to go out in Mumford all over the place, and then New Orleans, never becomes
Right. Well, I guess I would think it's not necessarily our job to decide whether it was an atrocity or not, but to think about the ways in which participants have used the language of atrocity to describe these things. Mm-hmm. There are cases, I was thinking historiographically of Philip Halladin's Shelton Laurel Massacre, which was one of the first books to kind of reorient historians to thinking about these. I think that's 13 men in upcountry North Carolina, Unionists that are murdered. And it's, compared to Centralia, a relatively small event. But nonetheless, to your point, Jamie, the impact of that was quite profound for Unionists in the region. And so I think part of our job, at least as historians, is taking that language and understanding how people in the 19th century used it, recognizing that they're using it politically. There's no neutral language, An unfortunate outcome of war is, the language of the War Department sort of accounting for collateral damage or the other terms of art that have been invented in the 20th century to account for civilian casualties. Which do happen, but that's, I guess, part of our challenge up here is it seems to me to kind of expose the skeleton on these.
The first serious theorist of air power, Gilles Duhay, said, there's no such thing as collateral damage. The purpose is to get the civilian population to quit the war. And if you just hit the armed forces, you're going to get a long, drawn-out war of attrition like World War I. Whereas if you just go after the civilians from day one, then that will end the war quicker. And in fact, the war will be so terrible, no one will ever go to war again. So peace on our time, right? There's a certain sense the nuclear. It didn't
work out great.
The nuclear standoff in the Cold War does kind of validate that, because it was eventually resolved through other elements of national power, not military, because there was the terror, the fear of mass civilian populations. Again, get to the utilitarian purpose, the utilitarian argument for, the value of terror as a weapon. I'm not saying that I'm all in on that, but I'm just saying there's perspective there.
I wanted to go back to something, kind of what Aaron mentioned, and maybe like Cecily mentioned, is the idea of, those narratives, the stories, and I think the repetition of it. And the 19th century, how did they define it? And then if that definition is accepted by others. Because if it only appears once, like who read that? Is it accepted? Is it actually getting kind of, I don't know what the word is, like legwork? I don't know what the word is. I'm 7 weeks postpartum, my brain still doesn't work. So bear with me. If one person calls it atrocity, but no one else picks up that word, has it been accepted as an atrocity? But if the books keep getting published, people keep reading it. So I have a few POWs who would actually edit each other's work, and they would say, that's not how I remembered it. You should change this word to this. Like actively editing each other. Oh, I don't remember it that way. Maybe you should adjust it. So it creates this story that others repeat and others repeat. And guess what? Then you get the same story over and over again, and people accept then that this was an atrocity. But if only one person says it and no one else says it, is an atrocity. So you mentioned about those oral histories. People in that community heard those stories, recognized it as an atrocity, but until it gets out to the wider world, is it recognized as an atrocity?
This is a good question. I think, yeah, you're right, that the repetition and the expansion of those stories beyond, and then the work that we can do of trying to pinpoint what's actually happening and look for corroborating evidence and things like that as well. But yes, if the story is kept entirely within the community and entirely within a memory of a few people, then it's not something we are able to include and consider when we think about the the impact of the war and the way we might call something an atrocity.
And you mentioned cooperation, and Aaron, you mentioned this yesterday, is with Fort Pillow especially, is what makes another Fort Pillow so unique is not only is it just Union eyewitnesses, it's the fact that we have corroborating Confederate evidence, which kind of it gives it more legitimacy, perhaps? What do you guys think?
I mean, this conversation reminds me of E.H. Carr's What is History, which was published in 1965. He's a Russianist, a political scientist, embarrassingly, who wrote a great book called What is History? And one of Carr's points that long ago was, what is a fact? And he says facts they're not like a dead fish lying on a marble slab. A fact is something that becomes incorporated into historical narratives. And his point was about the kicking to death of a street vendor in Victorian London. And he said, this sort of doesn't fit with our vision of how Victorian people comport themselves. They don't kick people to death in a big mob. But it sort of was introduced by a scholar, and then another scholar of Victorian England pulled it up, and then another scholar, and then within about 10 years, it was a kind of part of the factual knowledge of Victorian England.
Haskell's comment on Gettysburg. Out of this will come something that'll be agreed to be the history. So,
I mean,
get local.
Once you free yourself from the notion that any of us can write history objectively, you'll feel much better. You have to sort of just release that idea that there's an objective truth. Like, there are facts. This attack was ordered to take place at 6 a.m. and Leonidas Polk decided to have breakfast, and the attack didn't take place till 10 a.m. That's a fact. But the way that you use that evidence, right, as the historian, is not neutral. So there's no such thing as neutrality in history. There's no such thing as objectivity. And so the more loaded your terminology, and what Ethan is pushing us to think about, does it matter if the murder of 2 people by guerrillas is called an atrocity? That's very powerful language to use to assign to an event that we might not naturally think about as atrocity. But if the victims or their families or the memorial tradition decides to use that word, they're doing it for a very particular reason. And so we also have to consider that. When you're reading historical sources and when you're reading historians, one of the best things you can do is ask yourself, why are they saying this and why are they saying it that way? Once you start to think about that, you can start to kind of put things together to build this stratigraphy that we call historiography, but to see this change over time, not only in sort of what happened in the past, but how historians have talked about it. And nobody is objective. We can all strive for it. And our profession was founded on the idea that we could be objective. But I don't know any historian who would actually say that they've written a completely objective history. We all have a purpose to this, just as the people in the past had a purpose behind writing things down, putting memory in place, and preserving their experiences for us to read today.
I would say yes, and also we're not ever going to write the last word. Right? This is how we're still here at Gettysburg, writing more books on Gettysburg and learning more things. And in fact, I'm not saying that entirely facetiously. We really are learning new things. And so, a certain degree of humility and a recognition that for 20 years we called this an atrocity, and then we stopped calling it an atrocity. And then 45 years later, we began calling it that again. That we as historians come to these things with the sensibilities. I usually say to my students, historians are people too. Right? They sort of absorb the culture around them. And so necessarily they reflect that in their writing. And the result is the language that's used to characterize and interpret changes as well. Much as we might like to write the definitive book, if we learn anything in graduate school, it's that there's no such thing.
There's a reason that so many books are now being written about the Indian Wars that use the language of coin, like counterinsurgency. Because that is what the current generation of historians grew up experiencing. The world in which they lived was a world in which we were fighting a war on terror in the Middle East. And they're applying sort of that worldview, which they imbibed unconsciously, sort of growing up and going through school and so on. And now they're trying to think about, does the past and patterns in the past conform to that? I mean, we're all going to be doing that kind of all of the time. And of course, there's no coincidence, right, that historians of the Civil War get really interested in guerrillas about 5 years after the end of the war in Vietnam, right? So you can always also think about when is a book written and what might have been informing it. So you also have to know the history of the history and place that in context.
Why don't we move to questions? We've still got, 25 minutes by the clock, but I don't know that we don't have to necessarily run that whole time, and I suspect there are questions, and so we'd like to hear from you. So we'll start over here on my left, the gentleman in the green and blue.
All right, I'm going to ask a terribly unfair question to a group of outstanding historians. It is June 2024. Are we witnessing atrocities in the Ukraine, in Gaza, Israel? How do historians look at these current events?
Yes, it is. The answer is yes.
The answer is yes, right, exactly. Anybody want to gloss?
Yes, in an interesting way, in a way that speaks to atrocities in the Civil War.
Well, I think we mentioned the word, the violation, right? The violation of the laws of war, the customs of war, what is expected, especially between combatants and non-combatants, and who become victims in these wars, especially in Gaza, what we're seeing with a ton of not even a ton, that's too small of a word, for the number of non-combatants who are being killed there. But again, Israel may not accept that as word because they're the one perpetrating it, and they're saying it is maybe an unfortunate incident in war to serve their strategic purpose.
And I think it's why we spend so much time trying to contextualize how Civil War Americans tried to put boundaries and definitions and rules in place to govern war, right? I mean, when Lieber develops his code, it's really a revelation, but it shouldn't surprise us. I mean, they, like us, are constantly struggling with this question. And so I think one thing it illuminates for the Civil War is that human beings whose kind of existence is defined by a state of war. This is what humans have always done. They wage wars, but they also try to put limits on and govern them. And so that's a question I think that Angela kind of leads us to with that statement is we need to contextualize and define, and then it's really for people later to either put those things in conversation or accept or question the definitions that were in place at the time.
Yeah. Good. Yes.
Yeah, great.
And to get to the concrete example, maybe the discussion of using the word atrocity as a political statement, depending on who you say it. Several of you during this discussion have referred to Andersonville as an atrocity. Why is Andersonville considered an atrocity and Elmira is not?
Oh, I would argue Elmira is as well. But at the time, the way that they wrote the narratives and who got their books published and where they were accepted, the radical Republicans, especially as part of Reconstruction immediately after the war, are going to wave the bloody shirt, is a term that is used. And Andersonville is going to get a lot of attention. They are victims. There needs to be punishment. Of course, Henry Wirtz is tried and hanged for what happens at Andersonville. And so that gets a lot of attention. Confederates don't largely start writing until the end of Reconstruction. So I'd say Elmira, Camp Douglas, those are all atrocious, but they don't get the same kind of narrative space or memory space as, say, Andersonville or Belle Isle.
I also have to repeat in response to the question about Gaza. These views do not reflect those of the United States government, the United States Army, the Command and General Staff College, or I guess anybody responsible.
Yeah, I said my views do not represent those of the Department of Defense or the Defense Security Cooperation Agency.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm a little nervous about doing this because I have a dine-in with Dr. Riotto, and I'm afraid she might ban me from the table. And I'm also going to use one of her metaphors, or one of her favorite metaphors. I don't consider the deadline incidents any kind of an atrocity for the simple reason that a prison camp is set up to control people purposefully, and I don't think that's considered, the control is not considered an atrocity. And you've probably seen a couple of movies about World War II where there is a deadline called the warning wire. And it was accepted that if you cross that, you're going to be shot at and probably killed. I think the commentary about how it's perceived by the victims and their families is important here. You know, somebody kills my son. Yes, that's an atrocity, but I might consider an atrocity if it had happened down here on the field as well, because I'm not objective. But I just don't see that as being an atrocity at all, except in the context of the victim's family not understanding.
Yeah, we could talk about this more also at the dine-in, but I love that you use the term accept. They accept it that if you cross that line, that you were liable to be shot. There is a lot of discussion among the prisoner of wars in their narratives that they did not accept that the deadline should be there. Because oftentimes that's maybe where water was, if the clear water, when they had Providence Spring pop up, that someone maybe was so weak that they fell over and then they were shot, or the guards were doing it for fun. So the term acceptance is key here. Again, who is telling that story? So yeah, we could talk about more of the dine-in, but I love that you use that term. Do they say, is that legitimate violence or illegitimate violence?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
It seems throughout the Civil War that African American troops were probably disproportionately the victims of atrocities as opposed to white troops. Do we know of specific examples where black troops did perpetrate atrocities against white troops, perhaps in response to some of the massacres that took place?
There's really none that I know, but I think one of the remarkable things about Aaron's book is the pointing out that, there was violence in the war, but the people who had the most reason to employ violence and retribution would have been the slaves. Now, I approached Aaron's book with apprehension because I was told as a historian there would be no math involved, and it was the calculus of violence, right?
I can't do actual calculus, so don't.
Did you come with that title?
No, that was a press title.
Okay. Yeah.
So I will say that I think that's true, and Pete in his comments said that he was pushing back on my argument about kind of a nonviolent or non-lethal black response, and he talked about the USCT, which is certainly an active response, and I was talking about. Not people in the USCT, but ordinary black civilians. There are a couple of instances. C.C. Washburn, who's commanding at Memphis in 1863, would have been 1864, after Fort Pillow, actually gathers his black troops and says to them, "I am tasking you with avenging Fort Pillow." It's not quite clear that they actually take that and do anything with it, but there is a fair amount of evidence that he was sort of hoping to inspire some kind of a retaliatory system by black troops in response to the massacre at Fort Pillow. That's one of the few places. But again, it's actually hard to trace that into an actual event in the war itself.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of is, again, it's all about stories, it's all about narrative, is a number of African-American units would be used as guards in prison camps, because it was seen as like the bottom rail is now on top, right? Not only are you actually guarding Confederate prisoners of war, but you're also humiliating them with their former enslaved or what have you, guarding them. And Confederates would tell stories of angry, barbaric, animal-like black guards committing atrocities against Confederate prisoners of war. Again, are they corroborated? Do we have the evidence that this actually occurred? But the stories exist. So that's one case of maybe you might hear about that, but again, was there actual evidence for it?
Yeah. And you can't forget, white Northerners are as terrified of the prospect of African Americans being unleashed to do violence as Southern whites are. Mm-hmm. So, the fact that you have one officer who says, you can be a little rough on them. I think even most enlightened Union officers would be, I'm not going along with that. Oh, no, and of course, USCT were officered quite severely and suffered much more punishments. Mm-hmm. The rates of mutiny, the executions for mutiny among USCTs. I mean, the USCT, if anything, experienced atrocities as a result of the white officering, as opposed to them committing them on behalf of the United States government. There are a whole bunch of sort of large-scale executions of supposedly mutinous soldiers, generally for conduct that was with white soldiers would have earned sort of stockade time, but certainly not the execution of 5 or 6 people. This happens in Jacksonville just after the war ends, but it happens in a bunch of spots along the Department of the South. So,
Yes, sir.
Thank you. First, a comment. Atrocity is an interesting choice of topic for just before dinner. So maybe if we do this again, we could have it earlier in the day.
Blame Pete.
Oh, okay.
Pete's taking a note.
Yeah, I'm not trying to put the rap on you. I'd like to bring it around to lessons learned, the topic. And this is within atrocity as the way it's dealt with within the military. And let me start by saying I'm not familiar with the post-Civil War analysis by the military and the criminal justice system, I guess civilian as well, of what had happened during the Civil War and how soldiers might have been involved in atrocities. I'm going to bring up a divisive moment in 20th century American history where atrocity was examined quite sensationally. And I'm not trying to make an objective statement about it, but I think of the trial of lieutenant or captain, I can't remember which at the time, William Calley. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, it seems to me that despite how you come down on the verdict, there was a process in place. It was very clear. And I'm just wondering, was that established partly by lessons learned from the Civil War? And, I'm just interested in the process, particularly if the Civil War had an impact on it, or how it developed where we got to the point where that process was in place.
He would have been prosecuted through the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which did not exist before World War II.
Okay.
Generally, before World War II, things would have been like that would have been handled within the company, with the company commander's authority or NCO authority. It was after World War II that created a more objective UCMJ, but the general idea was if anything like that was going to be penalized or anything like that, it would be through court martials, judge advocates, but there was no UCMJ before that.
What do you think about kind of the codification of the laws of war? Like we talked about how earlier we have more like customs and expectations of war, but Aaron mentioned it yesterday, I think a few of us have mentioned the Lieber Code, which is kind of a predecessor to the Geneva Convention. It's like the idea of that now we actually have them written down and we expect people to prescribe to these now recognized laws of war. So I think that's a lesson learned, is realizing that you actually want it down on paper so people are expected to read it, know it, and then act accordingly.
Well, and of course, you also have the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, which remains sort of criminally understudied. There's a wonderful book by Bruce Tapp that is very much worth reading on the Joint Committee. But that's the kind of closest equivalent I can actually think of in the Civil War of someone going outside of the sort of Army Code of Conduct. This is Congress, and it's typically radical Republicans are kind of driving this, but they're trying to kind of make a point of embarrassing particularly Democratic generals who they love to haul up before the committee. I mean, they love to bring up McClellan, they love to haul up Meade and question them about sort of what they were doing down to a tactical level. Benjamin Wade had no idea what tactics were, but he was going to pass judgment on people like Meade, sort of absolutely. But they also investigate several events that we would consider atrocities. But they start with Ball's Bluff. Was their really first investigation, which is viewed as a slaughter of Union troops, and they're trying to figure out what went so wrong that there was this sort of incredible disaster at Ball's Bluff for the Union. And so, if you're thinking about if you're thinking about these kinds of investigations having a political valence, the Joint Committee would be somewhere you'd probably be really interested to look to see some parallels.
Again, Dr. Fry in his presentation talked about, in response to Q&A, the distinction between how you deal with a citizen army versus how you deal with the regular. I'm looking forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
Talking about, this is a citizen army in the Civil War, but they are going to go back to the regular army in which there's less outside scrutiny. So the army will be free to discipline its own the way it sees fit.
And there are prosecutions for atrocities after the Civil War. They're all of guerrillas. The ones that I know of are the U.S. government arresting people like Champ Ferguson in Tennessee and prosecuting him for murder. This happens with 2 or 3 guerrillas who are also executed. Sometimes it's only Henry Wirtz is the only person who was executed for war crimes, and I would say that's not true, that these post-war, this is sort of May, June, July of 1865, there are, because there are some guerrillas that refuse to surrender, and when captured, if they aren't killed in capturing, and of course many of them are accidentally killed in being captured, they might be formally prosecuted, and some of them are in courts. I think we're on this side now.
To paraphrase the Ben Franklin character in the play 1776, as a general rule, with some exceptions, can we say that at the time of its occurrence, atrocities happen in the third person, not in the first person, as in their atrocity, not our atrocity?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's political language, and it can be used either to castigate and stereotype your enemy, or in a way to excuse your own conduct. I think this is part of Pete's point in talking about what might have transpired in the Hicksford raid, is that the Union's burning of homes was perhaps a response to the murder of Union soldiers, which was itself perhaps a response to the sexual assault by Union soldiers of white Southern women in Sussex County, right? And so there's sort of, depending on who you ask, some of those are atrocities and some of those are appropriate responses to atrocities.
And I don't think, and Cecily brought this up, is that it has to be one narrative from the perpetrator versus the victim side. She mentioned that there's one unit in the Sand Creek that stays back, right? They're like, I don't want to be a part of this. This is atrocity. So it could even be on the same side as the perpetrators, but they recognize it. That's not our atrocity. They're the one actually doing it.
And you could think of the burning of Darien, too, was famously immortalized in glory, right? Shaw is horrified at what sort of his fellow colonels are doing, and he doesn't want his men involved in it. But there's a chain of command, and that he has to follow that as well. But I think Shaw immediately sort of starts writing letters to distance himself from what happens at Darien, right?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Were there atrocities committed in trying to force people from like prisoners and others to serve on both sides? The reason I'm asking that question, I noticed in both Russia and Ukraine, they're putting prisoners in battle, and I noticed that all of our Army, Air Force, and Navy are way under recruiting. I think we have about 40% less people than we had like in '87.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
And what are we going to have to do? You know, we're paying tens of thousands of dollars of bonuses, and we can't get people to serve. What's going to happen?
So the question maybe is conscription?
Well,
or
I was wondering what kind of atrocities were committed on both sides to force people to fight.
For prisoners of war,
Criminals particularly.
Yeah, there wasn't necessarily for prisoners of war. There wasn't. I wouldn't. Again, that overarching atrocity is they weren't like sticking them at gunpoint saying you better sign up to fight. But some individuals on both sides would sign up to fight just to be able to get out of prison. There's something called galvanized Yankees, is that the idea that you're galvanized, right? It's just gold plated, but it's still just like metal underneath. Is that they signed up just so they could get out of the prison camp, and oftentimes they really didn't trust them, and they would send them out west to fight Native Americans. But it's because they're escaping the larger starvation, that larger atrocity, rather than actually singular threats. I don't know about your case.
Well, I'm not fighting per se, but I definitely came across when I was, again, studying labor, right, and particularly labor for building fortifications. One of the first sources of labor for building the fortifications in Virginia was the prison population. And so it wasn't, let's go to enslaved people first. Like, let's look at what other pools of labor we could take. And then during the war, there is a back and forth between the Union and Confederate High Command outside of Richmond, because there's examples of black prisoners of war being put on the fortifications because the Confederate government's argument is, well, these are just runaway slaves, and building fortifications is what slaves should be doing, not soldiering, right? And I'm blanking on which Union general, but I think it's maybe Burnside actually puts a couple Confederate prisoners into the Union fortifications and tells them to start digging as a sort of retaliation. And then there's a lot of correspondence back and forth, and everyone says, okay, we won't do that anymore. But that is another example, certainly, and that was seen as, by the Confederates as just a huge violation that somebody would do that.
And the anti-deserter units in places like Western North Carolina commit a fair amount of violence, sometimes torture against men who are avoiding service or who have already deserted and are kind of hiding out. The records on that are pretty clear as well.
Yes. So we've talked a little bit about some of the atrocities on civilian populations. We know widespread about looting and destruction. You think about Darien, Fredericksburg, Chambersburg. Until Pete's talk yesterday, I don't think I've heard any mention in any of the books I've read about incidents of rape, which would be remarkable in the course of human history of invading armies, especially of this size. Is it part of that silence Pete was referencing, or is it just remarkably not occurring as it has throughout human history in the Civil War?
I think to keep in mind, the silence is certainly a factor, but these are also two societies that sort of were one society prior, and which both would have abhorred that kind of behavior. So I think there's something going on too about the sort of mutual intelligibility of the two cultures that are fighting the Civil War, and the degree to which they both would have sort of really put that kind of beyond the pale. And so I think partly that may explain why we don't see sort of as much of that, because we certainly know it happened, again, when fighting Native peoples or sort of non-legibly sort of Anglo-white European. But these two societies are so closely bound together. I think it sort of would have been viewed as really the worst thing that you could possibly have done. But I don't know, other people have thought.
And you said, I was going to say, racial dynamic. Yeah. You said Native Americans. Is that the expectation among white Anglo-Saxon like that? But you do see rape of black women as the armies are moving around. But again, where are those? Are they written down? What have you? But also the expectation that they are other, that they may have lesser. And huge amounts of reconstruction. The
U.S. government executes about 200 of its own soldiers through the course of the Civil War. All those court-martial records are collected in one place at the National Archives. About half of them were deserters. Of the remaining, let's say 90 or 95, about 50 of those are, 40 or 50 are rape cases. So there is a prosecution for, sexual violence is a serious problem in the Civil War. The U.S. Army recognizes it. Pete mentioned Marcina Patrick, who was the Provost Marshal General for the Army of Potomac, who was ruthless in tracking down reports of rape or sexual assault by his soldiers. There are a couple of episodes where women come to camp in the morning, report on it, and there is a investigation, a prosecution, and an execution that day, and soldiers are executed at 6 p.m. Those are pretty clear cases. The footprints go back to the tent. The woman IDs them. But it shows, too, the degree to which, in at least a few of these cases, the women expect that they will find justice from an institution like the U.S. Army. So the executions of U.S. soldiers are disproportionately black men executed for raping white women. And we know that there were probably more rapes of black women, either enslaved or free black women, by white soldiers. And so it's been very hard to get the evidence on that. Crystal Feimster at Yale is writing a book on this. There are a few other people doing research. The court martials, and part of this too is the problem of the distribution of court martials records in the National Archives, which are distributed by Army. They aren't consolidated except for just the executions. So everything that got a lesser sentence is sort of impossible to find. But I think there's actually still a lot of work to be done on this. I will say, and I think this was a point that Pete made as well. Well, actually, I'll save that point. That's all I was going to say at this point. Thank you. Okay, thanks. Yeah, we've got probably time for 2 more questions.
I guess, I wasn't expecting to hear Gaza mentioned here. This isn't even my question, but I guess if we're struggling to define atrocity, I think atrocity within the context of genocide is above and beyond. And you don't have to respond to that. I don't want my friends on the left to have to read their disclaimers again. But my question is about, we're talking about racial disparities. In the National Archives, there's a photo of a U.S. colored troop being lynched or hung in Petersburg. And the caption is that he was attempting to rape a white woman, and he's condemned, and the rebels send over a flag of truce requesting that their troops can watch too. And the Union agrees to this. World War II, black troops make up about 10% of the American military, but account for about 80% of executions. Again, these are crimes that would be, rape, murder, that kind of thing. Can a nation or a state almost use atrocity in an advantageous way if perpetuated by their own troops as a way of enforcing these systems of control?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's why they do it, right? I mean, that's why, the entire company is brought out and forms a U when a deserter is shot. I mean, it's supposed to be a deterrent. Yeah.
But beyond that, I guess not just in a military context, but in like same rules apply here. You go home, you can be lynched by a mob for the same thing.
I would say, again, it's up to that community. I would say Southern communities accept it, that lynching was a legitimate way of keeping the African American community inferior under the system of white supremacy. I would say that the African Americans would disagree.
I mean, my friends who are affiliated with the DOD might not agree with this, or they might. I mean, the kind of standard complaint is that the Army is not a social laboratory, and yet in a democratic society, it seems to me that it's always a social laboratory, that it always reflects the values of our society, and that's a good thing. So that when the Army commits atrocities at Abu Ghraib, people are outraged and those atrocities are punished. The fact that black soldiers are disproportionately over-prosecuted is a reflection of the same misrepresentations of justice in the criminal justice system for citizens in the United States. So it's sort of no surprise that that carries over. And I mean, it's a bad thing in that context. I think it's a good thing in the sense that the Army itself as an institution in a democratic society carries our values. Sometimes, in retrospect, those values don't look like the right ones, but we have the capacity to change them. The Army is subject to political control, and we're the politics, supposedly. Thank you. Okay, we're over time, but let's do one last question anyway.
All right, a little closer to home then. Robert E. Lee's invading Confederate Army comes into Pennsylvania in June of 1863, captures hundreds of African Americans. There's, 50, 100, 200, the numbers are soft, but nonetheless, he captures African Americans, takes them south. We don't know what happens to them. So the question is, does that fit the definition of atrocity, and was it for an economic reason? I got a black guy instead of a horse, or is it a political process? Is it to create terror? Just like to hear your perspectives.
Yes, and both. Certainly, there's a need for labor in Virginia. Oh, sorry, two microphones. There's a need for labor in Virginia, but it's also sending a political message. I think it's both of those things. And yes, I think we could call that an atrocity.
And he would have said it's contraband, right? This is as an invading army.
Or that they're runaway slaves, and this is that we're just doing what we've done for the last 15 years. And catching the runaway slaves.
Good. Okay. Well, we've got Pete needs to make a.
Can you tolerate one more?
If it's a question, that would be great.
One last one.
If it's a question.
All right. It's very intimidating asking a question of a panel of highly educated professors. So I'll shield my hero, Barbara Tuchman, who would say, I was not burdened by an advanced education. It's interesting, I think, at conferences and other events, tours on the battlefield, when people learn, almost by source of discovery, that the Civil War was a war. And that atrocity, I would think, can be defined by war aim, that atrocity is something that should not have happened. Not Civil War related, but New York Review of Books just published an interesting article on the D-Day's anniversary on how the heavy bombers in France caused the death of 50,000 French civilians. Is that an atrocity? Or is it a side effect of a war aim? I would argue, and be interested in opinions, that atrocity reaches the point where it was not a legitimate part of a war aim, that it was something like Fort Pillow that ought not to have happened. I think that we can agree that some things ought not to have happened, and other things are war.
The historian Richard Overy, when he was analyzing the air war and the effect of non-combatants, said that if a Western ground army had gone into Hamburg and 40,000 people were dead, civilians were dead, we would have no question calling that an atrocity. The fact that it happened from the air creates a sense of detachment from what actually happened. And it's an odd way about how we just think about what's an atrocity versus what. Is it the effect, 40,000 dead, or is it the way you did it? Through air power, which gives a sense of detachment, or versus people who are on the ground facing people face to face and killing them, lining up against walls and killing them. Effect's the same. Again, as I mentioned the My Lai massacre, a couple hundred were killed in that. In the air bombings, many were killed more. Many men were killed by fewer men. So what's atrocity?
I might suggest Malmedy and My Lai did not fit a legitimate war aim, and therefore ought not to have happened, as opposed to heavy bombing, which was part of the war campaign, as opposed to shooting people on a wall, like you said.
Okay, so we've got one final comment from Pete, if you can remain, and then I think we're done.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think
panel.
my mic is on now. Yeah. So before we thank the panel, I just want to say something to maybe put everyone at ease. The CW audiences have always asked for us to do things that have relevancy. And as you can imagine, sometimes that takes us far away from the history of the Civil War. And that also makes people uncomfortable. I applaud the panel because they've been asked a range of very difficult questions that require very sophisticated and sensitive responses. And the question that they had about Gaza and Israel as well as the Ukraine, I thought that they handled it in such a way that they were not trying to advance any political position or a personal position. They certainly were not making a case for advocacy for any side. If any of you have interpreted it that way, again, I hope that you just take a moment, and you're welcome to have a conversation with them. But I just want to reassure people that obviously we come here for our great love of the Civil War past. I think that all of us, though, are always searching for ways in which those questions of the past can inform and shape and connect to issues of the day. Our panel on race and Lincoln, I think, was a really good example of why I'm always so proud to be part of this group, because we took on a topic which there are very few places, it appears, in this country that can discuss it with reason, respect, and moderation. And I just want to reaffirm my appreciation to the panel for how they handled that discussion. I also want to show my appreciation to the person who asked that question. I do understand why that question could have made people just a little bit more than just uneasy. And they might have thought, you know what, I didn't really sign up for this. I certainly respect why some people, again, that's maybe not what we should do here. I hope you'll just try to extend some understanding to all of us. We all come to this with different needs, different interests. And again, I think that the panel did a really nice job. And so with that, thank you so much.